Good day, students. I hope you are doing well today. I'm Sanmarie Steenkamp, and I will be presenting the assessment and evaluation, which is part of the Advanced Certificate in Senior Primary Education. This will be done unit by unit. There are 9 units in this specific course, and there will be 3 different sessions in which I will do 3 units at a time. So today we'll be looking at Unit 1 to 3, and we will discuss every point in each unit shortly. I would like you to remind that we would love for you to do some self-study, and also due to time constraints and a lot of info, it is important that you read through your study guide and not only work on whatever we present here. There are much more information in your study guide. Okay, so we will move on to look at the broad aspects within the units, Unit 1, 2, and 3. As you can see, Unit 1 is about the basic assessment concepts and perspectives. Unit 2 deals with general and primary assessment directives of Namibia. Unit 3, we look at the aims, construction, and application of assessment tools. Okay, so let's look at Unit 1. Okay, broadly, Unit 1 focuses on Bloom's taxonomy and the 3 learning domains. This is the larger part of Unit 1 that focuses on this. Using particular verbs is important for effective assessment activities and learning outcomes. Unit 1 also focuses on the learning and educational objectives and differences between terms such as measurement, tests, examination, formal and informal, formative and summative assessments. So in other words, this unit is about the importance of evaluation and the types of evaluations that one gets. We'll shortly look at an outline. I will not read every point in the outline, as I will be discussing points 1.1 until 1.14. So in your study guide, you can look at the headings there as well. Okay. All right. So we'll be moving on to look at point 1.1, the 3 different learning domains of Bloom's taxonomy. You get 3 different domains, which is the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the psychomotor domain. When we look at the cognitive domain, it refers mostly to the intellectual capability and skills of the learner. This domain describes the increasing difficulty in thinking skills of the learner that is expected as the knowledge and content becomes more difficult for them. There are 6 categories in this domain, and they are knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. The cognitive domain is also the primary learning domain. Moving on to the affective domain. Affective domain refers to the emotions and feelings of learners. It also revolves around the learner's interests, attitudes, beliefs, awareness, and values is reflected in their behavior in this domain. So that would be how they ultimately incorporate the values of a discipline into a way of life. The last and third domain is the psychomotor domain. As the word also refers, psychomotor, it has to do with performing a sequence of motor activities with accuracy, smoothness, rapidity, or force. This means its functions is on the manual and physical areas, and the learners are expected to acquire a skill and to do something. Thus, in this domain, a learner will produce a product. Underlying of this domain is the cognitive understanding. The learner must have knowledge and understanding of the content before he or she can demonstrate a skill in a certain task or in this domain. So you will see how they build on each other. You need the cognitive domain to understand and improve your skills, the affective domain, which is more about understanding and emotions and feelings before you can do a certain action in the psychomotor domain. There are several different points in your study guide. Please go and read and make sure you understand this. We'll now move on to 1.2, which is the different multiple intelligences. Gardner described 7 different intelligences, and they are namely the linguistic, which refers to words and language, the logical mathematical, which is the logical thinking, musical, it's pretty simple, it's that person's musical ability, bodily kinesthetic, which means body movement and control, spatial visual, it's the visual and spatial perception, interpersonal, which is the perception of other people's feelings, and intrapersonal, which is self-awareness. Okay. We'll move on now to the learning outcomes and educational objectives in 1.3. We look at the difference of these two, and I will first discuss the learning outcomes, and then we'll look at the learning educational objectives. So learning outcomes is about what the learner is expected to know, to understand, and able to demonstrate after completion of a process of learning. The purpose of learning outcomes is that learners have an understanding of expectations. Teachers have indication of content, learning and assessment activities that they can use. It also influences the learning domain and the level of learning required. This will become a bit more clearer as we move on to the educational objectives, where we differentiate between these two. So 1.4, also 1.3, the educational objectives. We see immediately that it's much broader than learning outcomes. Different types of objectives can either be institutional or general. The purpose of educational objectives is to prepare teaching and or learning programs. It facilitates course planning, learning, evaluation. It helps in the curriculum design, and it helps select the correct approach of instructions. So when we look at these two, we can see that, I'm just going to go back to learning outcomes. We see that learning outcomes are much more focused on a specific task. I can take the example of a learning outcome that could be that on successful completion of this lesson, a learner will be able to count from 1 to 50. That is a learning outcome. So it's much more specific than the educational objectives. An example of educational objectives can be where learners express themselves orally, read appropriate texts, and write reasonably correct for their everyday purpose in their mother tongue. So that is one example. So you can see how one is much broader than the other. Okay, we'll now just move on to some definitions in 1.4. And here we look at 3 terms that are very important in this unit: measurement, tests, and examination. Measurement is a collection of quantitative data, in other words, information about quantity. It's also to determine the amount and extent of some quality. Tests, on the other hand, measures the learner's knowledge and skills. The word test also means to investigate. In this regard, test differs from measurement because it is generally qualitative. Examinations is to determine a learner's ability to complete a certain task, demonstrate knowledge of what has been learned. It focuses more on the work than, it focuses on more work than tests, usually an entire semester's work. So as we all know, we normally write examinations after we've done a certain module or finished a semesters of learning. So there's normally a fixed time when it comes to examinations. Okay. Next, we'll be comparing in 1.5 formal and informal assessment. Again, I would like to remind all students that not everything written under each point is mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation. You need to go and read up in your study guide. I will only take out certain aspects and mention it here. So when we look at formal assessment, as the word says, formal, it normally takes on the form of a standardized test or the grading of a presentation or a section of reading. Formal assessments are used and interpretations is made about the performance of a learner against a set of expected standards. Okay, so you have a certain set of standards that you work with when you formally assess a learner. On the other hand, when we look at the informal assessment, again, look at the term, it says informal, which means it will be measuring a learner's performance by casually observing them. And many times the learners aren't even aware that they are being assessed. So informal assessment is not really interested in facts or figures or numbers, but they are concerned about the content and the performance of a learner. Okay, so that one is pretty clear. Use logic, understand the terms, know what they mean. This will help you to learn and to study easier for the examinations and assignments. We move on to continuous assessment and, continuous assessment. Sorry, wrong way. Okay. Continuous assessment is where the learner is assessed throughout the learning process. I put that in bold because that's what continuous means. It means it's something that goes on throughout the learning process and not only at the end of learning. Advantages for the learner in continuous assessment is that a full range of the learner's performance is captured. Its strengths and weaknesses can be identified. Enrichment activities can be designed for faster learning. Time to correct problems after assessment, and it supports self-evaluation. And lastly, it provides information on achievement. All of these different types of assessment, the best way to learn it and to remember it is to look at the name and to try and apply it practically in your own life or in your learners' lives, in class, wherever you might find yourself. The next type of assessment we'll look at in 1.7 is the formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment can be described as any assessment made during the school year in order to improve a learner's learning, and it helps shape and direct the teaching learning process. Summative assessment, on the other hand, is an assessment made at the end of the school year, based on the accumulation of the progress and achievements of the learner throughout the year in a given subject. Okay, again, formative, it's something that is forming, and summative, you can think of the word summary, to bring everything together at the end of the year. Okay, move on to 1.8, which describes the challenges of coursework. There are quite a few points here, and it's good to go and see what each point means. If you are teaching already, see if you can relate to the points that they mention here when you work with coursework. So the first one there is time management, which is probably one of the biggest things that most teachers struggle with, to get certain work done in a certain time, because some learners are slow, other learners are fast, and you have to work with these different levels of progress with your learners. Over-enthusiasm is another one. Parents doing the work, unfortunately, teachers don't have much control over that, and that would make it difficult for the teacher to really assess a learner, because you don't know if he had done the work himself. Difficulty level, this relates also to the time management and the different aspects connected to that. Plagiarism, that's a big one, and not only for you as a teacher, but for you as a student as well. Plagiarism is when you copy work directly from a source and you write it in your assignments. It's actually a criminal offense when you have plagiarism, and it could happen that your assignment might be totally discarded if there's any plagiarism in it. Sources can be from books or from your friends' work, anything in that line that is not unique to your own work. In other words, you need to take the sources and you must change the word that it makes sense and put it down in your own words. Okay. Favors well-to-do learners. So coursework could be focused more on learners who learn quickly and do well. More appropriate for practical subjects. There are very few practical subjects in schools these days, in terms of if you have to compare practical subjects with theoretical subjects. So in the last point, it adds to the workload of the teacher. So that's another challenge where the teacher might have too much work to do and too little time to finish it. So all of these also link together. All right. 1.9 is the self and peer assessment. When we look at that, we see that self and peer assessment generally is about revision and improvement. It enables learners to independently assess their own and other learners' progress with confidence rather than always relying on the teacher's judgment. So some of the advantages of self-assessment is that a learner can identify their own learning needs. A learner also gets to know their own strengths and weaknesses. And the last reason is that it makes them think. Advantages of peer assessment. Peer assessment means that you are putting learners that are in the same grade, almost on the same level of progress or level of achievement, into groups, and they assess each other. Thus, this brings the learner in contact with the learning content. It encourages cooperation between learners, and it encourages active learning. Okay. Furthermore, in your study guide, you will also find descriptions of advantages to teachers with regard to self and peer assessment, some disadvantages, and also the similarities. Please familiarize yourself with these. All right, we're going to move on to 1.10, where we look at alternative assessment methods. So alternative means that apart from the assessments that we have mentioned earlier, there are some other assessment methods that one can also use to see how learners are doing. Some examples of alternative assessment methods can include homework assignments, learning conversations, and classroom projects. So the principles that underlie alternative assessment is that it assumes knowledge has multiple meanings. It treats the learning as an active process. It emphasizes process and product. It focuses on inquiry, and it assumes the purpose of assessment is to facilitate learning. Okay, so here then we see how learning can develop through assessment. All right, make sure you understand what each point means. It is of not much use if you're just going to learn what stands there, but you don't understand it. Okay. Moving on to 1.11, we're going to look at the levels of thinking that is required by verbs used in assessment. Okay. So you have written exams before, you have written assignments before. So some of these verbs you will recognize, and you will also see in which level of thinking it falls. What one immediately sees here is that there are 6 levels, and we recognize these levels as the cognitive learning domain of Bloom's taxonomy, which we discussed a bit earlier. Each level builds upon the other level, and we see that number 1 is to remember, 2 is understanding or comprehension, 3 is to apply, 4 is analyze, 5 is evaluate, and 6 is create. Some of the verbs that you will see there at remember, for example, can be tell, list, describe, or relate. So a question starting with the word list aspects that you find in whatever, which means that you have to make a list. You're not going to write an essay question there. Understanding is a way of assessing the way that you understand a certain aspect in a test. So this would be a bit more elaborate than remembering. To apply, there you come to solving a problem, to show how you got to the problem. Those are the verbs that one uses in assessment. Analyze, some examples of verbs there is distinguish, examine, or compare. Evaluate, you can use words like judge, select, or choose. And lastly, create is to invent, compose, and predict. So you will notice here that the levels of thinking becomes more complicated and more difficult from number 1, which is the easier one, until number 6, which is the most difficult one. There are many more verbs under each category here. Let's see in your study guide. All right, moving on to 1.12, where we look at evaluation. So in general, evaluation is described as a process of analyzing, reflecting upon, and summarizing assessment information, making judgments and/or decisions based on collected information. There are 3 types of evaluation: process-based, outcomes-based, and impact-based. Again, I'll remind you to look at the terms, look at the words. It makes it easier to remember. So process-based evaluation is useful when you assess how a program is working and the results that it delivers. In other words, the process that the program goes through and then the result. Outcomes-based measures any changes immediately after implementation of a program. So this one is focused on the outcome of a certain program. And lastly, the impact-based examine the long-term effects of a program and what the influence that it has on its participants. Okay, so that's also focused on the end result, but not at that moment after a long period, if it still has the same value. Okay. We'll move now on to 1.13, where we look at the purposes of assessment and evaluation. Assessment is most important, or assessment's most important purpose is to gather evidence of learning and to give teachers the information they need to provide quality instruction. The primary purpose of assessment is that it needs to be summative and also formative. Other purpose of assessment is that it informs teaching, it promotes and encourages learning, it promotes optimal individual growth, it motivates, it gives and gets feedback, you can grade and assure good quality and high standards. In addition to these purposes, distinctions in your study guide is also made in terms of the purpose of assessment when it comes to assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. This you will find in your study guide. Right, so we've done now the purposes of assessment, and we'll move on to the purpose of evaluation. Okay, evaluation is an important part of assessment and evaluation. Evaluation is an important part of assessment, and the evaluation process is the adjustment teachers make to their teaching and the activities used as a result of collecting and analyzing data. So evaluation is for the teacher to adjust their teaching methods and ways that they teach the learner. The purposes of evaluation is that it measures programs' outcomes and impact. It informs future program planning and design. It provides important internal lessons for those conducting programs. It ensures transparency and accountability, and it provides broader lessons about good practice. Okay. All right. Moving on to 1.14 is where we look at the principles of assessments. I only took the most relevant words here, the most important words here. You can familiarize yourself with these 12 points, but basically it comes down to assessment needs to be relevant, it needs to be fair, it needs to provide useful information, it needs to draw on a wide range of evidence, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be valid. Assessment also needs to be appropriate, accurate, be integrated into teaching, manageable, transferable, and educative. Each of these points provides a bit more information of what exactly they mean. Again, look at the terms. If assessment is relevant, it means it has to reflect on what the learner has studied or learned throughout the semester, or at that specific point of assessment. Another example can be that it needs to be reliable. In other words, can you rely on the assessment to test what it needs to test, to assess what it needs to assess? Okay. And all of this you will find in your study guide.